Good morning, welcome into Bible study with us today. If you're watching on the day that this is being posted, then happy Ash Wednesday. Be sure to get out and get into worship and get your ashes. For those of you who are Calvary members, we do have services today at 3:45 and also 6:30. Again, that is 6:30, not the typical 7 o'clock time. So 3:45 and 6:30. For today, we are getting back into 1 Corinthians. If you see me look down here, it's because this is where my laptop is. We're getting back into 1 Corinthians. This is our second week in a 3-week series where we're looking at some of the different problems that the Church of Corinth was facing in the first century, and we're looking at how does Paul address these problems. And some of them are very specific, but we're not just asking what does Paul say, but we're also asking what does this have to say to us today? How can we learn from the mess that 1 Corinthians found themselves in? So last week, we spent some time getting to know Corinth, both the place, the geography, and how that impacted the people there and the church that Paul established there. And then we got into two problems. The first one was that they were taking pride in teachers. Some were saying, well, I follow Paul. Some were saying, I follow Apollos. And Paul comes to them to say, like, all of these teachers that you have, that you love and you take pride in, these are all sent. These are people, servants sent from God. So if you're going to take pride in anything, take pride in the God who's sending you these servants. The second problem that they were dealing with was you had these temples that were serving almost as like meat markets or butchers, and the Corinthians had to eat, and they were going and they were getting food, meat from these places, and these were animals sacrificed to fake idols. And even though many of them knew that there was nothing wrong with them eating this meat because it was food sacrificed to nothing, this led some people into sin. So Paul says if it leads people into sin, don't do it. So if you want to hear more about those problems and those passages, then you can go back to video number 1. Today we are getting into what Paul has to say about head coverings and marriage and singleness. And these two problems or topics have been put together because they teach us a lot about a couple of different relationships, both the male and woman relationship, but also the relationship between humanity and God the Father. So let's go ahead and we're going to jump into it. We're starting with 1 Corinthians chapter 11, beginning at verse 2. So I'm going to read it and then we'll go through a couple questions together. Paul begins, "Now I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions, even as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ. The head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every wife who prays or prophesies with her head covered or her head uncovered, she dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven." So our first question is, what appears to be Paul's hierarchy? He gives kind of an order of things here, and we're going to go top down. He puts God above everything, and then he has Jesus, and then he has man or husband, and then woman or wife. Now, taken out of context, that can be a very, very tricky thing to talk about. So we'll come back to that. Stay with me on that. What is the meaning of the word head? He uses the head in two different ways here. First, he's talking about the head as in somebody with authority, somebody in charge, like the head of a household. The second way he does it is more specific and literal, like your head, your noggin, the thing that is on top of your neck and shoulders. So it's important to understand that he's talking about two different kinds of head there. The third question is, how should each dress their head? Paul says, to the women, you should keep your head covered. That is a way of honoring your head. And what he means by that is honoring the one who has authority. So in this context, the husband. For the man, he says you should have your head uncovered. You shouldn't have long hair uncovered, or long hair that is covered. All right, so let's continue on. We're just kind of opening it up here. This is out of, and I've got 2 study Bibles out here, by the way. So if you've got a study Bible, I definitely encourage you to be reading all the study notes for yourself here. So I've got the Lutheran Study Bible and then also the ESV Study Bible over here. Here's what the Lutheran Study Bible says about this whole section. It says, the situations described in this section are largely foreign to our modern context. In Roman culture, both men and women conveyed their status, including their marital situation, by their appearance. A head covering, basically a shawl, draped over the head, conveyed that a woman was married and intended to remain in that situation. Some Roman women, however, sought to live as new women, who did not intend to remain faithful to their husbands. Women who uncovered their head immodestly drew attention to themselves by signaling that they were available to other men. So why is Paul talking about your head being covered or uncovered? Why is he talking about the way that you dress your head, how it honors or dishonors your head? Because this meant something very specific in their culture. For a woman in that culture to have their head uncovered, it meant they were single and ready to mingle and ready to find a partner or a husband. So for a married woman to go into the church with her head uncovered, that would dishonor her husband. So Paul says, have your head covered so that you are not dishonoring your husband. All right, continuing on, verses 6 through 10. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. That is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. So we've got 4 questions that we should answer here. First off, what's wrong with a woman cutting her hair off? If letting your hair down is a sign that you are looking for a partner, then you've got 2 options. You can either cover your head, or you can just get the clippers out and shave your head. And so he says, don't cut off your hair, don't shave your head. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut her hair short or shave her head, let her head be covered. So why is it disgraceful? In this context, those who had a shaven head, as far as women go, could mean one of 2 things. And we're not exactly sure which way it goes. It could have been both depending on different situations. But the first one was this might mean that this woman was somebody who had been caught in adultery, and this was kind of her scarlet letter, acknowledging to the public her shame and the things that she had done. So Paul says, better not do that. Better not make this society think that this wife has done this if she hasn't. And the other one was that it may have been a symbol to indicate to society that you were a prostitute. So Paul says, better not do that either. So he's going on to say that we've got 2 options. Either we shave our head, which is not really an option because of what it will tell society, or we cover our head. Question 2, how is man the image and glory of God? Well, we talk about how we go back into Genesis, into the creation account, and it says that man was made in God's image. So that brings us into another question. Let's back up for a second. What does that mean? Made with characteristics or qualities. Does that mean that man is God, that man shares holiness as if man is God? No, absolutely not. We've fallen into sin. We've lost that image. That is partly restored to us in baptism. That image will be completely restored to us, on that last day. But let's not mistake us into saying that there's an equivalency between man and God, because that's just far from the truth. So if that's the case, what is the image of woman? Because woman is made in the image of man, right? Man is put into Computer's falling asleep. There we go. Man is put into a deep sleep, and God opens his side and takes part of his rib and creates Eve out of that. Okay, one interesting thing that we talked about in Bible study this week was this transitive property that if A equals B and B equals C, then A must also equal C. So if man is made in the image of God and woman is made in the image of man, then there's a case to be made that woman is made in the image of God as well. And what we're pointing at here is, and Paul really develops this, and we'll talk about this more as we get going, is that Paul is not pointing at that one sex has the upper hand over the other, that one is somehow better or more valuable. He's pointing at an equality of husband and wife, of man and woman, that we are called to be one in unity with each other, but also one in unity with God. Okay, now we get to verse 10 here, which is kind of interesting. That is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. So what's the deal with the angels? So for that, I'm going to go ahead and read out of the ESV Study Bible here. Where are we at? Chapter 11. Oh, I'm in the wrong spot. This is great TV, I know. Chapter 11, verse 10. Oh, it's because I can read it out of here. What am I doing? Symbol of authority. In Roman culture, the head covering signified married women's status. I'm sorry, ignore that. We already talked about that. Because of the angels, what does that mean? A difficult phrase that likely conveys the idea of in heaven, so on earth. Just as angels observe proper respect in their worship of the exalted Lord, so on earth people should do the same. All right. Now moving on to verses 11 and 12. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman. And all things are from God. Kind of, again, we're not letting one dominate the other here. Just like woman was made of man, now how is a man made of woman? And how is anyone made without the blessing of God? So question one, what does this say about the man-woman relationship? Again, one is not over and above the other. One is not valued by God or Jesus more than the other. There's an equality within the husband and wife relationship. Question two, what does this say about the God and humanity relationship? That one, this relationship is a gift from God, and just as man and woman are called to be one with each other, that unified relationship is called to be one with the God who has created them. Okay, so let's ask this last question to close up this section. What might this, or how might this relate to the sacrificed meat problem that we got to last week in the last video? What this points us to is this idea that believers and Christians, we are called to be different. Right? Like we are a holy nation, a royal priesthood of people belonging to God. All of those things. And the way that we treat each other in all of our relationships, and here we're talking about man, woman, or husband and wife, the way that we treat each other, the way that we love each other, it sends a message to the world. And we're called to love each other in the same way that God the Father has loved us, the same way that Jesus has loved us. So we need to be aware, we need to be cognizant of how we live out our relationships with each other, because it says something about who God is to the rest of the world. All right, let's continue on to our next problem. Problem number 4 for Corinth. We're talking about marriage and singleness. So we're going back a few chapters. We're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, beginning with verse 1. Beginning at verse 1. Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. All right, you may have noticed that at the second half of verse 1 there are some quotes. Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, and then in quotations, it is good for man not to have sexual relations with a woman. What does it mean that Paul has put these in quotes? Well, it means that this is a specific issue. Time for a new class for the kids. This is a specific issue that the church in Corinth is asking questions about. It's a specific issue that they're having, and that they have directly gone to Paul and said, hey, you got to talk to us about this. You got to help us understand this. So Paul is addressing a direct concern that's been brought to them from the church in Corinth. Here in these opening verses, they also mention this idea of conjugal rights. What are the conjugal rights? It was kind of funny in Bible study this past Sunday when I asked this question in a room full of all adults, nobody under the age of 40 except for me, and all the adults were kind of looking around like, who's going to say it? It's talking about a sexual relationship. That they have a husband and wife has a right with each other to experience that relationship. And Paul is saying that it's but because of the temptation of sexual immorality, each man should have his own each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights. Like, don't withhold this. Like, this is okay within this marital context. And he says, likewise, the wife to her husband. They have a right to have this kind of intimate relationship. So what issue might this point to for the Corinthian church? The issue here is that there's been almost an overcorrection. You know how if you're driving and you have to go a little bit, like you find yourself kind of veering off to the right a little bit, and then you way overcorrect. That's kind of what the church is doing here. They've taken this gift that God has given them of sex, this gift that is supposed to be confined to a very specific relationship, and they've overcorrected and are beginning to wonder, are they not allowed to enjoy that ever, even in the context of marriage? So we're getting into this idea of marital abstinence. All right, we continue into verses 4 and 5. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer. But then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. All right, verse 4, he talks about how the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband has authority over it. And the husband, in the exact same way, does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. So what Paul is pointing to here is when we, within marriage, when we make these vows to each other, we give all of ourselves to our spouse. So this idea of a sexual relationship is we commit even that part of our lives to our spouse. Question 2, how is marital abstinence to be handled? Paul comes out and he says if you want to be abstinent for a period of time between you and your spouse, there are some things that should happen. The biggest one is that this should be agreed upon. This should be talked about. It shouldn't be withheld without being communicated. And when you agree upon it, first, that means you've got to communicate about it. And that you have to not just communicate, but you have to agree. And that you should set limits. So that way this doesn't go on to a time where you become tempted to break that abstinence in any way that does not involve your spouse. Sorry, my screen was going down there. So you have to communicate. You have to make an agreement. You have to be on the same page about it, and you have to make sure that the parameters that you're putting together work for the husband and the wife, so that temptation does not begin to creep in on them. Question 3 is, what would be the intention of marital abstinence? Verse 5 says, do not deprive one another except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer. This idea that it's like fasting, right? We're removing some part of our lives so that we can devote more of ourselves to God. We're turning down the volume on something else so that we can turn up the volume on God. All right, continuing on to verses 6 and 7. Now as a concession, not a command, I say this. I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. What does Paul mean when he says that he wishes all were as he is, to paraphrase? We can view this in two different ways. And I'm not sure if we can definitively say that's one way or another. The first way is we could say that Paul's saying, I wish everybody was single. I wish everybody was single. I wish everybody was abstinent. I wish that people were able to fully devote themselves to God the same way that Paul has been able to fully devote himself to God. So that's one way we can look at it. Another way we can look at it is Paul is addressing this issue of temptation. He's saying, I wish that everybody could resist temptation the same way that Paul does. So we can look at it as a matter of status, marriage or singleness, or we can look at it as a matter of temptation. Question 2 is, how should we weigh these verses today? Notice how it starts. Now as a concession, not a command, I say this. I wish that all were as myself am. Notice this is not a command. This is Paul just kind of giving us his honesty. And I don't think there's anything wrong with him saying that he wishes that everybody could be fully devoted to God, or that he wishes that everybody would have the faith that would allow them to resist temptation. Verses 8, 9, and 10. He kind of moves in another direction here. To the unmarried and to the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. To the married I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. Just like who's giving this charge. The wife should not separate from her husband. But if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And the husband should not divorce his wife. Now, why might Paul advocate so often for individuals to remain unmarried? He's done it a couple of times now. And the reason he does this is he desires for believers to be fully committed to the Lord. And he gives the concession that you can be fully committed to the Lord, and that you can be married and you can be fully committed to the Lord, but we are sinful people, and oftentimes when you're married, that's often not the case. In the same way, just like anybody is who's single is often not fully committed to the Lord because they're committed not to a husband or a wife, but to something else. But Paul is pointing towards this idea is he hopes that we can all be fully committed to Christ. Question 2, what does Paul's advice in verse 11, the second half, say about the Lord's view of marriage, and how is this new? So in verse 11, says, but if she does, she should to a married person. I'll just read from 10. To the married I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband. And the husband should not divorce his wife. What does this say about the Lord's view of marriage? Within this first century Roman culture, we very rarely, if ever, saw a woman separate from her husband. We would see a husband separate himself from his wife. Now, Paul is giving a new charge here, talking to the men, saying, not only is your wife not supposed to be leaving you, but you are not supposed to be leaving your wife. This is new for the men, that Paul is saying that God holds us all to a standard to be committed to one another. And when we face challenges within a marriage relationship, we have an obligation to try to reconcile with each other. So he's not making it, he's not giving the men the easy out that society would give him. All right, let's continue on with verses 12 and so on. To the rest, I say, again, not I, the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. So Paul is now turning his attention to a new specific audience, where he's talking to somebody who is in a marriage with an unbeliever. So we're talking about believer in a marriage with an unbeliever. And so he says, if you are a believer and your spouse is an unbeliever but is willing to live with you, then you should not divorce that person. And his reason for saying this is that our marriage, when we pour the love of God into our relationship, we pour that love of God into our spouse. You know, Isaiah says that my word will not return empty, my word will not return void. Like, it will do what it is, the purpose that it is sent out to do. I was doing some premarital counseling this past week or so, and it's a husband or a man and a woman who the man grew up in the LCMS church, and now his fiancée did not grow up really with much of any kind of religious background, but they've been able to reach this point in their relationship where they're ready to be married this spring. And so we're doing this premarital counseling, and what's been really amazing to see is how that relationship for this man, his relationship with God is now having an impact on his relationship with his fiancée. So the fiancée here is not saved by association, but the fiancée here is becoming holy because the love of Christ is flowing through her fiancé into her. So how are unbelieving spouses and children made holy? It's not through association. It's through the Word of God going out and doing the thing that it's accomplished to do. And this points us to this idea that we are called to take the love of God, take God's Word and pour it into not just this husband-wife relationship, but like every relationship, because it doesn't return empty and it doesn't return void. All right, verse 15 and going on. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? So in verse 15, it says that the person is not enslaved. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. Meaning this person, we're still talking about a believer and a non-believer in a relationship. If the non-believer is ready to separate and go off, the direction here is that the believer is is not bound to that person anymore. In verse 16, it says, talking about why they're no longer bound. Again, my laptop's falling asleep. There we go. Why are they not bound anymore? It says, for how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Now, again, I want to read the study notes here. 7, verse 16. Bible. So Paul probably intends a negative answer to these rhetorical questions, meaning like you don't know. You don't know if you're going to save your spouse in that way, or that's not a great way of putting it. That there is no assurance that an unbelieving spouse will be saved, and so the believer should feel free not to pursue the spouse who has left. So in other words, you're not obligated to live your whole life chasing after this unbelieving spouse, and you are free, and we have confidence that God will still work in that person's life. All right, a couple of closing questions as we talk about both of these problems kind of put together. What are the more general lessons to be learned from Paul addressing the Corinthians on the topic of men and women and husbands and wives? What are the general lessons to be learned? I would say that Paul addresses this, and he holds each sex to the same standard. And he's very specific, saying like we are called to love each other, we're called to take the love of Christ that we have each received and pour it into each other. We are called to be in unity with one another, and we are called to be in unity with God as we are in one another, unity with our spouse. He doesn't say that one is more valuable, that one is more loved, but he says that there is an equality within that relationship. And I think one interesting way that he points to that, that we didn't talk about in problem 3 a little bit ago, is when he talks about that hierarchy, right? He talks about how God is over, or that God is the head of Christ, right? But we believe in a triune God. And so do we believe that God is bigger or better or more important than Jesus is? No, absolutely not. We believe that they are one substance together. They have different roles, but they are one substance together. And that's the same thing that he's pointing to for a husband and a wife, that they are called to be one substance, not one above the other. Question 2, is there an overarching message that is being communicated to the Corinthians as Paul speaks to their specific problems? We did talk about this a little bit already. This idea that we're called as believers to be different. Throughout these first 4 problems that we've talked about, Paul is looking at the Corinthians and saying, you are called to a higher standard. Like, for example, when he talks about how although men are typically free to leave their wife if they want to, Paul says, but believers, Christians, not you. That's not the case. Or he talks about, with the sacrifice of meat thing, like even though you're free to go and eat this food, if it's going to lead people into sin, no, don't do it. Hold yourself to a higher standard, because the outside world is looking, and in all of the ways that we operate and live our lives, like our Christian life, speaks about who God is, and it speaks about what God has done for us. All right, that wraps it up for today. Again, thank you guys for joining us. Our final lesson, our final 2 problems for Corinth will be this coming Sunday in the Into the Word Bible study in room 125. 9:25 to 10:25 this Sunday, we'll wrap this whole thing up, and then of course, that'll be posted next week as well. So thank you for joining, and we hope to see you next week.